Welcome to Mandates and Megaphones, hosted by Jeremy Maggs, unpacking the politics, promises and power plays behind the G20 summit.
Hello and welcome to Mandates and Megaphones in association with Standard Bank. It's the podcast where diplomacy meets disruption and where grand declarations are tested by real-world delivery. I'm Jeremy Maggs. Now, as South Africa prepares to host the G20 summit, the first ever on African soil, we're not just hosting global leaders, we're inheriting global risk. Because this isn't just a moment for celebration, it's a moment of serious consequence. Let me tell you about the G20's complexity. It is staggering. 19 countries, one EU bloc, and now 17 engagement groups spanning business, science, parliaments, women, youth, and even the judiciary. It's a structure meant to represent inclusivity, but important that it delivers coherence. So can it anticipate risk, or do you think it's perhaps creating more? Well, Volker van Wudden is the risk principal at Risconet Africa. He is a seasoned strategist and one of South Africa's most respected voices on systemic risk. And he joins me now to discuss what the G20 really means for global stability and also for South Africa's own credibility as a host. So, Volker, a very warm welcome to you. And maybe a good place to start this conversation is with the big picture. Why does the G20, in your opinion, matter so much to global risk management and managers? What are you thinking? Where's your head in this respect?
Hi, Jeremy, and great to be with you again. I think the reason that we would want the G20 to succeed is that it's an aggregation of enormous resources and skills, and therefore an ability to influence. And so when one's looking at risk, you're always trying to recognize something and then do something about it. Now, in the G20, we certainly have the horsepower to recognize what's going on, and we have this, the overarching majority of the world's economic strength in which to deploy risk solutions or mitigation. So I think in that context, it's a very important grouping, and much can be achieved. But as you said in the introduction, it's a fractured environment, and therefore the risk of dilution is enormous as well.
Let's talk about that in just a moment. And Volker, I'm certainly not asking you to speak on behalf of the global leaders, but if you reflect on it, what do you think the systemic risks currently are top of mind for them? And the structure of the G20 itself, do you think it's going to help surface those concerns?
Yeah, so firstly, I would say the risks that are concerning to the global leaders from an economic point of view is really increasing, and if I may say, increasing deficits. So we've heard about the big, beautiful bill in the States, but, only 10 years ago that we had the acronym, the PIGS, Portugal, Italy, Greece and Spain and Europe, that we had deficits way over 100% of GDP. That hasn't gone down, that's gone up. And South Africa's deficit is not 76%, and that's going up. So deficit structures in many, many large economies, I think, will become a significant issue in the future, because to control these, you actually have to force the economies into a different space, which is accompanied by poor economic growth and other stresses. And then you have the external shocks, where things like weather, or it could be pandemic. Later over that, you've got technology, and then all through that, you also have societal disruption. So I think that the issues that worry us, whether finance causes them or finance is the result of them, there are some big ticket issues that need to be considered over the next few years.
Helping or maybe even hindering that process are these engagement groups that I referred to. And you mentioned the word diluted. And there's a concern surely that the model risks creating some kind of duplication or that dilution, or even a little bit of messaging fatigue, and it's going to be difficult to arrive at some kind of concrete or cohesive or agreed to solution.
Absolutely. Every member is a country and a government, and it got through, they're generally through some political elections. So they have specific mandates and areas to protect and look after in their own home markets, and overlaid on that, you've got each geographic area's own regulatory and legal frameworks. So the challenges to practical implementation, even if something was agreed, represent some interesting challenges. So I think from that point of view, a stance of what can be done, what is the execution framework for the proposed course of action, that is critical, because getting runs on the board and showing that the communique or the course of action or the group's objective is an executable and practical and feasible outcome, I think that's critical within all the legislative and country stakeholding frameworks that we have.
Volker, I like the cricket analogy, so if I can extend it slightly, all very well to get runs on the board, but there's got to be a decent umpire here, and that falls on South Africa as the host. And it's going to be critical for this country to ensure that the dialogue remains aligned, credible, and ultimately lead to action. And if that doesn't happen, therein lies the risk of inertia.
It's absolutely one of them. I would also say, the reality test is it's in South Africa now, and we're trying to facilitate a good outcome, and not but compared to what? Because we've had G20s for several years, and we've had them hosted in several places, and by no means were they were home runs, looking at an analogy in all of the prior G20 frameworks, because everyone had their own patch to protect or a particular critical objective. I think from the South African point of view, we are granted this G20 access representing Africa, but not because we are an economic power. So in fact, it's a polite inclusion of an African country into the G20 environment. So other than recognizing that, what are our strengths? And I think there are some elements that can be brought to the table despite our current interesting outcomes on the GNU. South Africa did go through a significant transition from apartheid to democracy. And there have been other successes where significant disparate opinions have been reconciled in certain ways in our environment. And I think that's one of the strengths that can be played. But for us to think that we can influence outcomes over 17 or 19 economic forums and groups is I think a little optimistic. Let's just do add value where we can, and let the bigger economic or regional players take a lead where it's appropriate to them.
Volker, part of the job of any risk manager is the process of information. And I'd suggest to you there is a risk of information overload. So using your experience as a risk professional, how do you avoid decision paralysis in the G20 process?
Jeremy, in my environment, and you've heard me say, measure what you want to manage. And there are two fundamental things that happen in the world. There's economic impact and obviously economic modeling. And then the corollary, the cousin of that, is capital deployment and impact and returns. And at the end of the day, we're trying to produce better economic outcomes so that populations in the world can benefit from those, or we can address the challenges that are coming through, whether it's health or aging or societal or environmental or otherwise. And to me, that's the big risk that happens both in the risk governance space, where there's lots of talk or jaw, but little action, and little commitment to a known, measurable, defined, improved economic or financial or capital outcome. And those are the fundamentals to me that come through. And if we turn them around, and there are one or two opportunities, I believe, that we can volunteer in this space, that's where I think the rubber will meet the tar. So rather than talking about alignments left, right, and center and praying for something, a good outcome, put it down into a measurable final benefit to your country, your economy, and the people who are there.
Part of managing risk is also adhering to good governance. And Volker, in that respect, governance mechanisms need to be put in place to ensure accountability, timelines, and the measurable follow-through that you have just addressed. What sort of governance mechanisms do you think should ideally be in place?
I think that, governance and risk relates to objectives, as does strategy relate to objectives. And the governance should then track what was intended to be achieved over really short milestones, 3, 6, 9 months, and specifics. So the governance element of it is the objective aligned, ethical, meets the objectives of the groups and G20. And through that, if we can't break those initiatives down to practical steps that have accountability and measurement, and where there's a small group that tracks the outcome of these, you can forget it. Because then you'll have a whole big set of committees and people reporting back and having reasons for why things did or didn't happen, and governance goes out the window. So it's got to be a practical, measurable, tight process, but in digestible steps, because of the wide range of issues that are at stake here.
On Moneyweb, you're listening to Mandates and Megaphones, and I'm in conversation with Volker van Verden, Risk Principal at Risconet Africa. He is a seasoned strategist and one of the country's most respected voices on systemic risk. Volker, let's continue the conversation, and part of good risk management is also making sure that you can handle conflict, and this could be interesting. You've got the B20, you've got the L20, for instance, business and labor. Traditionally, they can be foes. It's going to be difficult, surely, to reconcile inherent tension between labor and capital in a forum like this. Again, what lessons from the risk community can be brought to bear, do you think?
Yeah, so, if we're all going to fight about a cake, let's make sure that there is a cake to fight about, and splitting up the cake, of course. So in the risk community, what we're trying to do is minimize the downside and optimize the upside. And ultimately, one wants to create measurable and sustainable value through improved and better or effective risk management practices. So if we looked at whether it is the L20 and the P20, of course, labor wants to protect rights, sustainability, protected employment, all the rest of that. All of those rights have to be paid for one or other way. And similarly, under the business, of course, they want growth and profits and all the rest of it, but the growth and profits can't come at the price of massively insecure and unstable labor force and so forth. But at the end of the day, the generation of growth and wealth is what produces the benefits in the broader economies, but with respect to treating people in a fair, ethical, and honest way. So those rationales, I think, do succeed when you can demonstrate that there will be a net positive outcome for your environment, whatever that happens to be. And so rather than starting with 101 rules that must be abided by first, rather get one or two economic benefits going and then decide about an ethical sharing and a sustainable sharing of those benefits.
And I imagine that we're in quite a good place to steer that, given South Africa's ability to unblock logjams, political logjams in the past. We would have some leverage, I imagine, to help broker productive outcomes between these two traditional forces.
Yes, it's interesting how often we describe South Africa being at the brink and at the next brink and so forth. And somehow there's an interesting or an innovative alternative that pops up, and so we go. And I think that is a lesson. Of course, it's easy to see this with hindsight, but there are many, many cases where one thinks that there are intractable forces that are just hammering away at each other. Nothing can be done to move them. Yet there have been some interesting and creative alternative solutions. And I think South Africa does have a good record in considering solutions differently. And in that context, I think we can add a little bit of fluidity and benefit to some of those challenges. Yeah.
And Volker, this is also about forward thinking. So we've spoken about the B20 and the L20. Then there's also Science 20 and Startup 20. And critical there is bringing emerging tech into focus. And there are risks there in fast evolving spaces. I'm thinking of cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, and conversations around that have got to be bumped up the agenda. Again, something that the risk community worldwide and in South Africa is very cognizant of.
Absolutely. I mean, the AI and the technology space is just so big and moving so fast. And I think in that context, the considerations around dealing with are pretty tough because you've got lesser developed economies and very significant ones. And you think about how one, for example, could trace the authorship or manage the intellectual property that is being developed through AI and large language models and the rest. And it's almost that context gives you a concern that it creates a bigger risk of more haves and even greater separation to the have-nots. So I think technology and the way in which technology is shared for the good of all is probably one of the bigger evolving threats that comes through. And to me, that would be one area where qualitative and quantitative targets should be set, because it doesn't help to have the best technology in one country and yet maybe the education systems or health systems in poorer countries are just not getting the benefit of it. And I think that's an area where a real commitment should be made to sharing the best of the technologies.
And Volker, another issue that occupies the minds of risk managers the world over are ESG issues. And in this particular time, or at this particular event, they're going to span Women 20, Urban 20, and Oceans 20. And critical that climate and social resilience becomes hardwired across all groups. Again, something which one imagines the delegates are going to struggle with, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, again, there are sometimes very broad churches that are trying to be debated, with the intention, a fair intention, to come out with a positive outcome. I think it's clear that if one looks at the central theme, like to what extent are the rights of women in terms of politics, economics, education, access to healthcare, freedom of choice, if those became the critical measurements, and then you demonstrated the benefit to countries by having those standards well supported and well defended versus the obviously poorer outcomes where those standards are not there, I think that could be a central theme that can be measured and can be advocated consistently across the G20.
And Volker, another issue that I think is high risk as far as this event is concerned is global disparity or wealth disparity. And there's a concern surely that this body will simply listen to youth and informal sector voices without necessarily translating that into policy impact. And that particular paradigm has got to be not only observed, but I would imagine acted upon at some point.
Absolutely. And the other side of it is one needs to say, how did we get to that result? So in South Africa, we have the tragedy of 50% plus youth unemployment and obviously 40% overall unemployment. But how did we get there? It's a combination of poor economic policy, bad education systems, poorly developed skills in relation to what the economy needs, as a minimum, those kind of points. If we look at what caused the Arab Spring, repression, poor alignment, frustration with political actors, and governments totally out of touch with their populations. So if we say, well, look, we have this dichotomy between what we should be doing to protect and uplift the poor, well, sometimes we should get rid of the kind of issues that are deliberately causing damage to the poor. And some of those problems then become a lot easier to fix. So yes, we can hear it, but I think we should be recognizing the negative influences that some policies have on exacerbating those problems.
And potentially a moment for South Africa to act as a bridge between developed and developing markets, maybe.
Yes, because similarly, the necessity is the mother of invention. Where people are struggling, they've got to solve their problems themselves. So South Africa is a nation of entrepreneurs now. People have got garage work, skunk works, home things, all sorts of things going everywhere because they know that the formal economy is not really helping them very much anymore. And those skills, that liberation of talent and that ability to look around and create value-adding or trading opportunities everywhere is something that I think is very good about South Africa compared to very structured and perhaps ingrained economies and styles of business and economic activity that you'd find in the more developed economies.
And given that structure that exists in South Africa, often born out of necessity and desperation, you also argue that this country is well placed to push long-term risk frameworks. What do you think gives us the edge in that respect?
I think South Africa's risk maturity is actually, at the emergent state, if I can put it that way. But what we do have that's very good for those long-term frameworks is that we have, I think we were rated in the top 1 or 3 in our audit profession, was rated right up there for several years in a row. And I think our financial services sector is similarly very highly rated, around the world. So if you look at using those strengths to support and build long-term risk management frameworks, I think we've got 2 excellent tools there. But overall, the negative is that we are brilliant generally in the country at writing the rules and writing legislation, but poor at execution. But where you have to execute well, where you have to run a bank well, where you have to issue quality financial statements, those are the kind of areas that we're doing very good work in.
What about the role of civil society in all of this? Do you think it has a role to play?
Yes, I mean, it's an interesting point that the G20 is happening in fancy hotels, with all these important people and so many. And so what do the rest of us think? It's almost like the G20 is happening to us rather than with us. And so perhaps it would have been useful to have an opinion poll on the critical issues that South Africa and our people would like to have raised. So now I'm not talking about another big talk shop. I'm saying have a smart, tractable opinion poll that have good examples and get some sort of bottom-up feedback into these kind of environments that show what the populations and the social environments are really looking for as an outcome to these rather expensive meetings.
When you look at what is likely to happen, and again, we still haven't learnt of the recommendations, for instance, that the B20 is going to make to the South African government. We're still very much in the planning phase. But any good risk manager is always, Volker, looking ahead. So maybe apply your mind to risks of unintended consequences, where maybe well-meaning outputs could lead to impractical or disruptive policy. That's got to be ironed out in order for this event to succeed.
Yeah, one could say, what are we desiring to achieve? So a well-meant outcome could be inflation stability. How do you achieve that? Generally with higher interest rates. What does that do? Constrain economic growth, as many commentators do, but you do get the better outcome over time, but you've got to take the pain through the process. So, in that context, if we could achieve stable economic horizons that then plays into lower interest rates and more stable currency translation rates, that would be a good outcome. Now, the other side of it is that, and thinking about this, I think one of the unaddressed and fantastic opportunities of this kind of environment would be using risk equalization principles across the group. For example, globally, there are things called catastrophe bonds. And what happens is insurers buy proportions of these bonds, and if a nominated catastrophe takes place, they are then paid out. So it's a form of reinsurance, but it's in the bond and the financial markets. Now, if that kind of risk equalization principle was developed in the B20 or the G20, and it could be used to help countries out of natural catastrophes, or perhaps a drought, or maybe a major population issue, I think those are the kind of things that could really help countries amongst each other. So rather than saying, oh, you're wrong because you've got a deficit and now we're going to batten down the hatches, rather create new capacity that help countries through economic shocks that are unpredictable and unmanageable at a country level, but can be shared and can be carried at a G20 level.
So in conclusion, let me just put you on the spot ever so slightly. If you were advising, Volker, the G20 South Africa Secretariat, is there one thing you'd prioritize immediately to maximize impact?
Yeah, get back to measurable goals. Yeah. And the one thing is either it would be trade orientated on the one side, or it would be investment, infrastructure, and employment orientated. So looking at where the capital markets have the capacity and what they're looking to have as an assurance to deploy that capacity, because there's a lot of capital in the world. And if we unlock those few levers to get that capital deployed in this environment and get those particular actions as a priority, that to me would be a fantastic win. Because once you've solved the critical factors to deploy capital, you create a really strong annuity benefit after that.
Volker van Woerden, thank you very much indeed. That clarity really cutting through the noise. What's clear to me is that the G20 isn't just a moment for diplomacy. It's a test of design. It's a test of coherence and credibility. South Africa may have a once-in-a-generation opportunity here, not just to host, but also to shape, as we've just been discussing, to move the needle on risk, on resilience and responsibility. But obviously, success is not going to come from fanfare. It's going to come from real focus, as Volker has mentioned. That's it for this episode of Mandates and Megaphones, brought to you by Standard Bank. I'm Jeremy Maggs. Join us next time as we continue to track the pressures, promises and power plays defining South Africa's role on the world stage.
Thank you for listening to Mandates and Megaphones. You can find more episodes on moneyweb.co.za.